Hi guys, so today we're going to be reading the last chapter and the epilogue of Navigating Early. And if you remember, what had just happened was Early was at Professor Stanton's talk and ended up disproving his theory in front of everyone and then told the story of Pi to everyone in the auditorium. Chapter 35. When Early finished, the auditorium was silent. The moderator stared at the chalkboard and then back at Early. "Well, you've given us a great deal to think about, young man. I'm sure there are many of us who like to take a closer look at your figures and ask a few questions." Professor Stanton's face grew red. "This is absurd. He's a boy." He turned his attention to Early. "You can't come in here with your silly story and prove that my theory's wrong." "Yes, I can," Early replied without emotion. "I could see it coming like a freight train." "Cannot." "Can too." Professor Stanton didn't know what I knew all too well. There is no arguing with Early Auden. But the professor was a learned man, and he'd figure out sooner or later. "Cannot." "Can too." Probably later. The story of Pi seemed to be one that could conjure up a lot of different memories and connections. Pi's story was a journey, like that of Fisher. But as Early talked this time of Pi being hurt and losing his way, it reminded me of someone else. During the ride home, I glanced sideways at my dad and noticed for the first time the worry lines on his face. He wasn't in uniform, and his body seemed to relax without the weight of his metals and brass. I thought about the way he had clung to me when Early and I returned to Morton Hill, like a sailor who'd been washed overboard and found a life preserver to hold on to. Could it be that my father, the navigator, had been washed overboard and lost his bearings, just like me? I could imagine my navigator ring at the bottom of the river, and I was sorry I'd thrown it, but I also knew that I didn't need a navigator ring to find my bearings. When we were back on campus at Morton Hill, my dad gave Early a warm handshake. "You did a fine job back there, son," my father said. "I haven't the faintest idea of what you were talking about, but you seem to have all your I's dotted and T's crossed." Early smiled. "Yes, sir." Early passed me on his way back to his workshop. "I don't think your dad was paying attention," he said, in a whisper that was loud and clear. "There weren't any I's or T's in the equation." My dad shook his head as Early walked away. Then he leaned against the Jeep and crossed his arms. I felt like when he talked to Fisher, easy and open, like he'd just taken a deep breath and was letting the words exhale out instead of holding them back. "I should have never brought you so far from home," he said. "I guess I just didn't know what to do. Imagine that. I give umpteen commands all day long and navigate a ship all over the ocean, and I couldn't figure out what step to take next." He shook his head. "I'm sorry, Jack, about packing up all your mom's stuff. I just thought if I could put things in order, I could make things right. But I couldn't." He raised his face to the sun for a long minute. "Well, what do you say? Maybe it's time to pull up anchor and head home." I leaned up against the Jeep next to him and crossed my arms. "I don't know. I don't mind it here. And see, the thing is, I sort of wrecked a boat a while back." I raised my face to the sun. "You want to help me build a new one?" And then here's the epilogue. Connecting the dots. That was what Mom said stargazing is all about. It's the same up there as it is down here, Jackie. You have to look for the things that connect us all. Find the ways our paths cross, our lives intersect, and our hearts collide. Once I started paying attention, I noticed all kinds of crossings, intersections, and collisions. For one, Fisher showed great improvement under the watchful care of a certain young candy striper at the local hospital. She had curly red hair and green eyes and answered to the name of Pauline. But that was only because that's what Early had called her the first time we met her at the Bare Knuckle Inn. And she thought it was prettier than her real name, which was Ethel. She took Fisher for long walks and even held his hand, which hardly shook anymore. Then there was Gunner's letter to his sweetheart, Emmeline. Gunner had given me that letter, asking me to do what he couldn't bring himself to do, mail the letter. So I did mail it, with my address on the envelope just in case. It came back with a handwritten note that said, "Return to sender." Apparently, Emmeline had moved on. So the The letter went back into the little rose-colored book of poetry in my desk for some time, where it would have stayed indefinitely, had I not chose Hopkins as the topic of my famous poet essay, and had I not acquired some of Early's deductive reasoning skills of putting two and two together. Although, with Early's method, it was more like putting together 2 and 2 plus a pinch of this and that. It happened one day in the library. I had to write a paper on a famous poet, and being familiar with Gunner's Firefolk, I chose Hopkins. Miss B said that she might have just the thing. She reached into her desk and pulled out a very old-looking book. It was a collection of poems by Gerard Manley Hopkins. She told me I might look at the volume in the library, but could not check it out, as it had been a gift to her. "Yes, ma'am," I said, taking the book to an open table. I glanced at the inside cover. In a masculine hand it read, 2E from G, Christmas 1928. The date rang a bell. Gunner had given a book of poetry to Emmeline for Christmas. Had it been 1928? I took the Journal of Poetry by Young Americans from my book bag and studied the name on the envelope. Emmeline Bellafleur. Inching my way closer to Miss B's desk, I hoped to spy something with her full name on it. She looked up from her work. "Can I help you, Mr. Baker?" This is a very nice book," I said, handing it to her. "Do you have a favorite poem?" She looked surprised by the question and seemed to catch her breath. "Well, yes, I do," she said softly. "I have a special fondness for The Starlight Night, all that talk of stars and firefolk and circle citadels." She seemed to get lost for a moment in the poem or in her memory. I carefully lifted the letter and said, "I think this is for you, Miss Bellafleur." She looked at the handwriting on the envelope and then back at me with tears in her eyes. I didn't stick around to watch her read it, but I knew I wouldn't be surprised if Gunner Scoglin showed up on the grounds of Morton Hill Academy in the future. Then there was Archibald McScott. The night of the cave and the snake bite and early seizure and a million other things, Fisher had gone back to the site of the bear attack to bury a second body, McScott's, but the one-eyed man and the 1894 Winchester were gone. There was a good deal of blood around the ground that led away from the site, but the trail ended at the river. We thought the bear had killed him right there on the spot, but in the light of this new evidence, Early thought maybe McScott had wanted to have a proper burial at sea, so he had mustered up what little life he had left to drag himself to the closest body of water and drop dead as he plunged into the river. Then Early thought better of it and decided that the Winchester, which had been the great burden of McScott's life, had become too heavy to bear, and maybe he'd just bent to drink from the river, but the gun's weight had pulled him into a watery death. Early seemed to find both scenarios equally gruesome and interesting, and never declared which he liked best. Back at school, the boys of Morton Hill Academy were always eager to hear the tales of Early's and my journey. As I told it over and over, I realized what an adventure it had been. Who would have thought that a motion-sick kid from Kansas would have embarked on a journey that included pirates, a volcano, a great white whale, a 100-year-old woman, a lost hero, a hidden cave, a great Appalachian bear, and a timber rattlesnake. In Maine! My mom was right. Our stories are all intertwined. It's just a matter of connecting the dots. I keep looking for her to pop up somewhere in this story, to somehow, mysteriously, be a part of the connections, intersections, and collisions. I keep feeling that I should have something more than just the broken fragments of her teacup tucked away in a box in my closet. But I know Elaine Gallagher Baker, the civilian. She'll turn up somewhere. And when she does, I'll hear her say, "There are no coincidences, just miracles by the boatload." In the meantime, I have a piece of paper on my wall. It's a drawing of my own constellation, with stars named Dad, Gunner, Miss B, Fisher, Martin, Eustacia Johansson, Early, and me, Jackie Baker. With a red pencil, I connected each star, and not so coincidentally, it formed the shape of a teacup with little red flowers. As for Early, in the weeks following our journey, he was invited for pie in Sam and Robbie Dean's room once in a while, and he even showed up for class once in a great while, especially after Mr. Blaine quit talking about pi ending. But he preferred to stay a little off the beaten path. He and I still went out for our early morning and late afternoon rows, and he still called out the commands, even though I could row a pretty straight line on my own. He always ended our rows by giving the command to let it run, and we'd stare out over the bay, admiring the endless ocean. Early Auden could not keep the ocean out. I figured he realized this too, because on a walk down the shore one day, not long after our Appalachian trek, Early started opening his stacked sandbags, emptying them into the beach. I asked him if he'd given up on trying to keep the ocean out. He said he was never trying to. He'd been using the sandbags to build a lighthouse, where he planned to raise a great bonfire so that Fisher could find his way home. Semper Fi, Early, Semper Fi. I stood on the shore that day with the salt water pushing closer to me with every wave, and recalled how, just a few months ago, I had stood on the same spot, so disoriented I'd thrown up. I marveled at the vastness of the ocean. I stood in awe of its depth and mystery, and I realized I was equally in awe of Early Auden. Yes, he was strange. Yes, he could be maddening. And yes, he was my friend. As the ocean tugged at my feet, I realized that Early Auden, the strangest of boys, had saved me from being swept away by teaching me how to build a boat, that numbers tell stories, and that when it's raining, it's always Billie Holiday. So that is the end of Navigating Early. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will see you later.